What's up, NineTen? Welcome to our last weekend in Selfless. Open up to Philippians chapter 4. But before we dive in, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the kind of hardships of this week. And I think it's been a weird week for all of us when it comes to the United States of America, when it comes to social media, when it comes to the riots of the last couple of days. And probably the biggest thing I'm going to push you to do is go over to North Coast Church as a whole. And I think Chris Brown did a really good job of addressing, this week and what it looked like. And it really did feel for me a lot like, man, this as a white male, there's a lot of it that feels a little bit like damned if you do, damned if you don't, where I'm like, man, I don't want to stay silent on it because there's so much out there that's like, if you stay silent, you are the oppressor. If you stay silent, you are racist. And yet when I speak up, there's a part of me that, one, there's an ignorance to it. Two, there's a desire to know more, and yet a fear of stepping on toes and saying the wrong thing. And so I know a lot of us have kind of been in that boat together. And I would just encourage you in this season to continue to press in. I think probably the worst thing we can do is just to go like, oh no, I totally get it. And I know everything there is to know about it, and continue to have those conversations with the life group leader, continue to have those conversations and kind of seek out knowledge and go, man, if we can be talking about it. I think the George Floyd incident was obviously a horrific one. And yet it is one incident in a myriad of incidents, and it was the one that we're talking about right now, and it was the one that was captured on film, but it's not new, and it's not something that's an isolated incident. And so I think we should be a people, specifically within NineTen, that are people that seek out, man, let's have conversations, and let's continue to educate ourselves on this and make sure that we don't just hide in the shadows or kind of pull the covers over our head and just go, it's more comfortable or safer to be here. So I think the worst thing we can do is just assume that we know. No, I know what's going on, and I know everything there is to know about it. But would we be people that in humility go, one, I know we live in a world where darkness is rampant, and where things like racism and slavery and sex trafficking, and there are a lot of issues, and I want to do something about those issues. And so again, the worst thing we can do is nothing. But I think we should also be people that go, Jesus is the solution and the one and only answer, and not that that's a cop out, but it has to be something that as we seek to be educated on them, we also keep Jesus at the center of it and go, man, what is my response as a follower of Christ? And so with that, I want to open up to Philippians chapter 4 and kind of dive into this passage that Paul talks about at the end of Philippians. He talks about a lot of what he's learned. And I love that kind of as a segue into what we're talking about today. Is we are people that we should be learners. We should be students of life. And even as we talk about that definition of disciple, it's a learner. It's somebody that sat at the feet of a rabbi, of a teacher, and went, I want your dust to cover my body, quite literally, as I follow in your footsteps, and go, I want to learn from you. And twice in this passage, Paul uses the phrase, I have learned. And I love that Paul at the end of his life is sitting there going, I'm a learner, and I'm somebody that has learned, and I made a lot of mistakes. I haven't done it all perfectly, but I'm a learner. And he says this in Philippians chapter 4, verse 10. I rejoice greatly in the Lord that at last you renewed your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned, but you had no opportunity to show it. I'm not saying this because I am in need, for I have learned to be content, whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I've learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do all this through him who gives me strength. Sean, probably one of the things, my favorite things I like talking to you about is kind of the newness to Christianity. And I'm curious for you, in your journey as somebody that has watched sports a fair amount and played sports in high school, talk to me about the evolution of this verse for you. When did you first hear it? In what context? And how has this verse become something that you've kind of changed your understanding on?
Yeah, I feel like once I stepped into wrestling, like there's always the Christian kids that would pray before their matches, and somewhere on their shoes or their singlet, they had that verse written on it. I was like, Yeah, but you're not going to beat me. But just kidding, just kidding. Yeah, I just, so that was kind of my context for it when I came into the church, was like, oh, that's like what Christian kids look to for sports and stuff, I guess. I don't know. I didn't really understand it. But I think quickly it took over my life, stepping into a relationship with Jesus, and also walking through like a lot of family trauma of mom who can't walk, and then mom who gets cancer, and then, yeah, like stuff with my dad. That contentment piece was really challenged in my life and relationship with Jesus. So I would say the first couple years was really hard to trust Jesus. But yeah, just progressively through watching him provide that contentment, learn to like seek that contentment quicker. And yeah, I think that's such an important piece that Paul states, that this is something that's learned, and you'll watch people further down the road like walk through contentment much quicker and much better. But the more that we get to like trust him, the more we learn to like be quick to find that contentment in him.
Yeah, that's so good. I love that. I love the challenge to be content, because it's something that so many of us are so bad at, right? We
Mhm.
we always want the next best thing, or we're kind of unhappy where we find ourselves. Or if we're freshmen, we can't wait to be sophomores. If we're sophomores, we're excited, for this next season. And I'm not saying it's wrong to be excited for the next season, and yet I don't know very many people that are fully content with where they're at and going like, I'm not going to romanticize the past. I'm not going to over romanticize the future, but I'm going to sit where I am right here, right now, and go, God, I'm actually like genuinely content sitting with you. And that's such a challenge for me. And I think that's probably one of my biggest, yeah, maybe hardships in prayer, even, to go, God, I'm not content sitting with just you. Like I want to get to my to-do list, or I want to get to the things that I have to get to today, or I have, these things that I want to accomplish, and these goals, and all of those things, like in and of themselves, aren't bad, but they can become bad if I don't have a contentness in Jesus. And Fruits, I want to come to you next and just ask the question. Maybe you can give us some context on why this statement from Paul is so significant, as somebody who is, shipwrecked and bitten by a snake, and, political monster Pharisee. Like, he did a lot in life. Why? Maybe you can unpack for us I know what it's like to be in need. I know what it's like to have plenty. I've learned the secret of being content. Why is this so significant, specifically coming from Paul?
And I look at the amount of times that Paul was jailed for his faith, yet still continued to like press on. And I think I've been thinking a lot about like what is persecution the past couple of days, and just thinking about like, to some people there's a great amount of persecution. Like to a Paul, he was imprisoned, he was probably made fun of constantly, spit on. You look at some of the examples of how like people were persecuted in the past Christian church, and then you look at like a church in China today where you have a great amount of persecution, where people aren't even being allowed to meet. And then you look at the little bit of persecution in the US today. And I think that God has each given us like a different capacity of persecution, but to each of us, we find persecution in our own ways. And when I look at like he couldn't eat, how he'd been brought low. He'd been, I mean, in every circumstances beat up on, yet to still have this mindset that like this life is not all that there is. I think he greatly had that, I don't know, eternal mindset to say like, man, I've learned in whatever situation that I can be content. And that's just so much of not a worldly contentness, but a contentness in something so much greater. Because everything in this world is going to fail. We're going to have people that love us and then all of a sudden turn and hate us. But the amount of contentment he had while being in prison is something that I just am in awe at. I honestly don't get it. How can you sit in prison, be content with being persecuted? It just shows that he had his faith in such a big God and an eternal mindset that like this world isn't all that there is.
Yeah, that's so huge. And I think the contentment in the midst of prison blows my mind, but I think the contentness in wealth also blows my mind too, right? He says,
Yeah.
like, I know what it's to not have a lot, but I also know what it is to have a lot. And I don't think I've ever met or seen, right, like a celebrity or you know, a extremely wealthy person or CEO of a company or something like that that's going like that said the phrase, I have enough money. Right? Like who said the phrase like, no, like I've done enough, I've accomplished it, right? Like that's kind of the allure of wealth, right? They did this study, Barna, who you're familiar with, Fruits, I know, but they do these like worldwide studies, and they did one on what it means to have enough money. And they went out and they asked thousands and thousands of people, and they said like, okay, how much money would you need to make to be like fully content, to kind of be able to buy the things you want to buy, you know, like you've made it, how much money would it take? And this whole group of people said, oh, if I can make $60,000 in a year, like that would just be bananas. Like if I can make $60,000, that would be enough. And so they went out and they asked a bunch of people that make $60,000. They said, hey, what would it take for you to just be totally content to be able to buy the things you want to buy? And all the people that made $60,000, right? Like you guessed it, they were like, oh, if I made $75,000. So they went out and they asked $75,000. And you can kind of like, you can take that train of thought all the way down, but there wasn't a group of people that didn't say, I need to make more money. And it's just like this crazy study that just shows us like we are these bottomless pits when it comes to entertainment, when it comes to specifically like money and finances. And I love that Paul says like I've done both sides. It's not just that I've been poor and imprisoned and broken and gone like, okay, Jesus is enough. He's like, no, I've also done the other side, and I've been wealthy and I've had plenty to eat, and I've had, you know, the food and the friends and the community and all, and like I had it all, and that didn't do it either. He said the secret to being content is I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. And it's that relationship with Jesus at the core of it that really makes that difference. And it makes me think of Ecclesiastes chapter 12. This is a book of the Bible written by one of the wisest people, probably the wisest person, maybe other than Jesus, to ever walk the earth. And he just says all throughout the book, he's kind of sharing his thoughts on the things that he's pursued that have fallen through. He said, I've tried, you know, women, I've tried sex, I've tried money, I've tried, you know, that I've done everything you can possibly do in life. And he says this at the end of his book. Did any of you ever like, this is probably a vulnerable moment for me, but you ever like open up a book and turn to the last chapter and like read the last chapter before you read anything else? I have, which it kind of like ruins it in some senses, but it's also kind of like, oh, well, at least I know how this ends. Or I'm like in the middle of a book and I just turn to the last chapter and I read the last chapter because I kind of want to hear like the concluding thoughts. This is a little bit what it's like, you know, for Solomon here. We get to hear his last thoughts, like his last words. Maybe not like his literal last words, but when he writes a book, he goes, this is how I'm going to end it. And he says this: now all has been heard. Here's the conclusion of the matter. And again, this is Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verse 13. All has been heard. Here's the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil. And he just kind of goes, here it is. Like, let me wrap it up for you. This is the purpose of life. It's fear God and keep his commandments. And it's very similar. It kind of echoes the Philippians passage to say, I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. I have an appropriate view of who God is, and then I can do the things that Christ asked me to do because I believe him enough to do what he says. I have the relationship with him that as I increase my understanding of who he is, what I do flows from that, which echoes what we've been talking about this whole series, right? This whole series has been have an appropriate view of God, his humility, his selflessness, his servitude. It all came from understanding who God is. That's the gospel lens through of Philippians chapter 2. But the gospel fundamentally always change. What does it change? It changes our perspective on who God is, who we are, and who other people are. It echoes the end of chapter 1. It echoes chapter 2. And I think I love that passage from Solomon just going, hey, here's what it boils down to. Have an appropriate view of God and then keep his commandments. Shar, I know you're in the car, but I'd love to come to you as we just kind of wrap up our time here soon of just saying give me a little bit of a so what there, maybe a heart piece of just going like, okay, I hear that and I understand that Paul found contentment and that he could live this life, whether he was imprisoned or wealthy, he could live in such a way where he found his contentment in Jesus. how do we do that? How do you fast forward into a media crazed, social media driven, man, I like the pace that we run at these days with sports and scholarships and going to college and wanting to go to college one day and getting the right job. Like, how is contentment even remotely possible?
Yeah, I just like wave your hand if something cuts out and I'll slow down. But
Okay.
something that stood out to me, and I think it relates to a lot of what you just asked, was like looking at this word strength. And I love that Paul includes it, because I was like, okay, what's the opposite of strength? And usually it means weakness, right? And so if you are weak, you need something to strengthen you, to carry you through. And I think the key to contentment is that we first have to recognize our weakness and our desperate need, that we are born in, with a God-sized hole in our heart that can only be filled through Christ. And through that strength alone, like that, even contentment, or to be satisfied, to be enough, like, I'm not trying to do all things through Christ who strengthens me. I'm not trying to be LeBron James, or like to be more, to be excessive. Like I'm striving to be enough, and that enoughness is found only in Christ. And I think when we know who God is and that he is sufficient, and we know that our identity, when it's found in like receiving that Christ is enough instead of trying to work so hard to make ourselves enough, we know, okay, like Christ is sufficient. He has all the strength. I get to walk in his ways. And that's only going to come when we accept, like, he is my new identity. And so, yeah, I love that he does talk about strength, and we have to recognize our weakness. And I think it relates so much to that idea of selflessness isn't thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less. And when we are weak, he is greater. Like he is greater than I. Like all of that, like repeating right now. And it's hard. Like in all honesty, on a practical level, I think how distracting it is. Like social media is designed so that we see what others have, and in some weird way we look at it and view, okay, that's what they have, now I must have it too. And so I think when Paul talks about, like, I've learned the practice of being content, like we do have to train ourselves. And it might be easy for us to be like, I want to sit back on the couch thing, and for life group to hold us accountable of like, hey, this is struggle. Like I'm struggling in school to be content that like I'm enough in the way that I'm studying, or that I'm content in just like my place on this earth. And I think we have to ask others to walk us along in that too. So yeah, for me, that big idea is first I have to recognize my weakness, to see that strength comes only from Christ alone. And in that, like that makes me so much more stoked to worship a God who I like need to rely on, because I know in myself, like I can't do it alone.
Yeah, that's so good. I love that. Thanks, Shar. I think as we wrap up here, I just want to challenge us with two things. And it's one, I think you're spot on with that contentment piece, Shar, of just saying in a social media driven world, it is so difficult to be content, because you're right. What other people have is always in front of me, and comparison is a thief of joy. And I'm not anti social media at all, but I think we should check ourselves pretty consistently to go, am I consuming social media in such a way that's making me discontent? And that can happen to me so quickly. And in a day and age like this, like, to be honest, like probably the last thing I would do right now is like encourage somebody to completely remove themselves from social media, because I think a lot of social media is connection right now, and it's community. And yet it has to be taken in measures. It has to be taken in doses, right? It's like anything, like it can be abused so stinking quickly. And I think I find myself deleting Instagram off my phone, even if it's for like a couple hours, just because I don't want to just have my thumb like going to Instagram, because that discontentment can get bred so quickly when I see somebody else's house remodel, or somebody else's, newer and nicer motorcycle, or, this like Forerunner build out that I look at and go like, oh, I could do that to my car. And then I start spiraling into these, like, this consumer mentality. And I think that plays out differently for all of us, right? Maybe it's outfits, or maybe it's, sports ability, or maybe it's whatever it is for each one. Like, I think if we all clicked on our Discover feed, it would tell you really quickly what you consume on social media, right? Like, that's how the algorithms stink and work. I'll never forget, somebody was like, tell me who you worship, or tell me how you spend your time, and then I'll look at your bank account, or then I'll look at how you spend money, or then I'll look at your, like, timesheet and what you punch in and what you punch out, week in and week out. Like, if you could take a journal for 7 days and just go, here's what I spent money on, here's what I spent time on, here's what I did. I wonder how many of our gods would be video games. I wonder how many of our gods would be social media. I wonder how many of our gods would be adventure, or surfing, or rock climbing, or whatever, right? Like, you could almost go like, no, I'm a Christian, I follow Jesus. And it's like, oh, you're talking about that, like, pie chart, right? If your week was a pie chart, you're talking about that tiny sliver that was like 15 minutes every morning. That's your God. Interesting. I hear the words that's coming out of your mouth. Your actions say differently. And I wonder, for each one of us, if we could kind of take that journal of the week and go, how does my time, how does my treasure, how does my talent push me towards contentment in Jesus, rather than seeking the things of the world around me? And I know that's personally convicting. And I wonder if this week that we can kind of wrap up our series on Selfless and look back on our notes and reflect back on the last couple of weeks and just go like, how is this going to practically change my life? And yeah, Fruits, I just want to come to you probably as the last person that comments here before we wrap up. But how has this series changed the way you do day in and day out life? Like, I feel like we as a staff have had really cool conversations about this. And I've appreciated your honesty over the last little bit of going like, this has been challenging and it's been hard. And yet I think this series has been, kind of a cool kick in the pants for all of us. But specifically, Fruits, how does this contentment piece, and then how does this series as a whole change day to day following Jesus for you?
Yeah, circumstances with this sermon, and then with some circumstances, or like with this series and then circumstances in my life, have taught me a lot about like where my priorities are, and am I really thinking of myself less. And like, one of the huge things that happened is got in a car crash, had to sell my car and buy a new car. And that was like piled up with learning about how Paul strains towards the gospel, learning about how he's like, whatever things, like, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, in contentment. And just seeing a firsthand example of how like something so material in my life that I lost, and then something I so idolized as money in my life that I lost, all came to a front, and thinking like, oh my goodness, am I actually thinking of myself less? Like, on a day-to-day basis, do I practically have an eternal mindset? Can I say that I pursue God? Can I say that the pie chart of my life, that like what I worship is God? Like, a quarter of my life, is it actually like lay up? And what I learned is just like, it was such a perfect, timely reminder for me that, man, I am so weak. Like, I loved what I typed in the chat that Shar said, the key of contentment is to first understand your weakness. And I feel like through this series, and through like a car accident, buying a new car, is that just learning how weak and fragile this life actually is. And then to read someone like Paul, and how I look at like, he is brought low and brought high. A lot of people don't have that. A lot of people have not like had the low of the low and the high of the high. Yet we can rely on the knowledge of someone else who's been through it and say like, man, if you get to the spots that I have been, you'll know that like, we can find contentment in the only thing that's Christ. In our lowest of low, we can find contentment of Christ. In our highest of high, we can find contentment in Christ. And like, we can do things through him. And I look at like, okay, how do I become more selfless? It's through the power of Christ. And in this passage, verse 10, like, it starts with rejoicing. Like, I rejoiced in the Lord greatly. And I think that to have a life that's selfless, and Christ gives us so many practical examples, it's to walk with Christ, knowing that we can do all things in him to find contentment where we're at. Like, it's just been such a practical thing for me of like, oh my goodness, where is my eternal mindset? Like, where am I finding contentment? Because it is so easy in a life of social media and comparison to look to all the other things. But we have someone here like Paul who's written this book towards us saying like, I've seen it, I've done it all. Like I've seen the highs, I've seen the lows, yet we can still find contentment in the one thing that lasts, which is Christ. And it's just been a huge reminder to me personally, like, where's my eternal mindset? Like if I do like a pie chart of my day, where does my time go? Where does my money go? Where do I can't find contentment? And I think, man, if we really want to be disciples of Christ, if we really want to pursue Christ well, I think we should take a real look at our lives and say, man, what are our priorities here? Like, are we really taking this example of Ephesians and looking at Paul's example of how he lived his life, this crazy eternal mindset? That's what's really stuck out. And like, are we doing that? Can we walk and have eternal conversations? Do we walk through our day and think like, oh my goodness, I can't wait for heaven. I can't wait for my neighbor to know the gospel. I can't wait to have an incredible conversation with my life group. I can't wait to talk to my parents and spread love to them. I just think it's been a challenge for me of like, man, I may be a few more years down the road than a ninth or 10th grader or an eighth grader, but I still struggle with this personally. Like the temptation doesn't go away, but we can all lean on someone who's been through it. Look at an example of Paul and lean on Christ just as Paul did.
Yeah, it's so good. I love that challenge to fail forward, right? Just to go, yeah, I'm about to turn 28 years old and I fail at this daily and just go, but I want to fail forward and I want to continue to lean on a Jesus. But it fruits me too. I think for me, the biggest conviction is Paul's statement that like, I consider it all a loss in comparison to knowing Jesus. I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. That they're both these laser focused statements that just go, I know what life's about and it's about Jesus. Like at its core, I want to pursue Jesus. And I think all of us could probably boil it down and go, if you strip everything away, like, yeah, no, that is what I want. And I think, I mean, in a season like this, 4 months into COVID-19, like the 52 of us on this call, you're on this call because you're pursuing Jesus, right? Like that's kind of where we found ourselves now, is we have this core of people in NineTen and a handful of leaders scattered in here that just go like, no, I really, really do at my core, I want to pursue Jesus. And yet there's so much in our lives that pull us away from Jesus and that foster discontentment. And I want that laser focus. I want it today. I want it this week. And I want that eternal perspective. And I think that's my prayer for us, is that God, would you increase my appetite for you and for eternal things? Because that's my desire. And too often my appetite is for temporal, and I want it to be for the eternal, and I want it to be for things that can satisfy ultimately, for 10,000 years, not just for the next 10 minutes. So thank you guys. Thanks Fruits. Thanks Shar. Thanks Sean for your thoughts. And I think normally this is kind of where we throw to music and the worship bar, the chat worship bar over on the right. But what I want to encourage you guys to do is, for some reason, I think the statement I have learned stood out to me really, really big in studying this passage. And I want to encourage you guys today as students to spend some time right now. So even if it's the next 20 minutes, right? Normally we would reserve the next 20 minutes or so. This call has been going from 10 to 11. We would reserve the next 20 minutes to kind of be blowing up the chat and do it very corporately. And I want to encourage you privately to spend some time, grab a journal, grab a notebook, an iPhone note, whatever it is, and just spend some time reflecting on this series and just say like, fill in the sentence, I have learned, fill in the blank, and maybe just take a 15-20 minutes and journal and reflect on this sermon series. And then I want to challenge you to do a second thing, which is probably a little less comfortable, but I want to challenge you to reach out to your life group leader and share that with them. Because I think, number one, it's really, really cool to spend some time reflecting, because I think too often we go, man, that was so good. Like I'll listen to a podcast or I'll listen to a sermon or whatever it may be. I'll listen to something and go, that was so good. And then I find myself like even hours later or minutes later going, like it didn't affect me. I'm telling you that it was so good, but I'm not going to implement any of it into my life. And so I think this is a really practical opportunity to, one, personally reflect, and then two, reach out to your life group leader and share it with them and go, hey, here's how this sermon series challenged me, and share the fact of this is what I learned, and this is kind of where I want to be kept accountable, whether it's mentally, physically, emotionally. I think there's some cool conversations that can come out of that. So I'm going to wrap it up here. Challenge you to do that. Even if you're watching this back and you're not on here live, I want to challenge you to do that as well. If you watch this later today on Sunday or Monday, Tuesday, even Wednesday before life group, this is our last fireside chats coming up. Our last week of regular life groups. Next week, June 10th. After that will be a kind of a fun wrap up for life groups before we dive into summer program. But yeah, as we wrap up this series, don't waste the opportunity to, one, personally reflect, and two, have a conversation with your life group leader. So love you guys a lot. I'm going to bring it back to gallery view here. You can take yourselves off mute if you want. Say bye to the people. This is still being recorded, so you can say hello to 910. Love you guys a lot.
Hello, 910. Goodbye.
Bye, 910.
Bye. Thank
Miss
you.
all of you.
We love y'all.
Love you. Bye.
On Wednesday.
Bye.